Hey noble ones! On this video I'd like to talk about the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth, as reported by the ancient Romans, or as his name was probably pronounced in his language, Yeshua. Some people try to prove he existed at all costs, accepting all evidence a priori. Others try to prove he didn't, refuting all evidence without even looking into the actual context. This is a critical historical investigation, so I will try to be as unbiased as possible, even though implicit bias, unconscious bias is inevitable to a certain extent. I'll do my best to be as fair as possible in my evaluation of the ancient sources, some of which we will read in the original Latin, and draw a picture of how solid of a historical figure Jesus actually was when examining what the ancients said. The video will not be about doctrine or beliefs, as I would never use my platform as a way to push my personal beliefs onto my subscribers. I respect you and your personal beliefs. At the end, having examined all evidence fairly, I will draw my conclusions, but feel free to let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments below. So, what sources are we going to use? On this video we'll examine mostly non-Christian evidence, with just a couple of exceptions. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, one of the greatest Roman historians and senator of Rome. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, Roman historian, early imperial era. Titus Flavius Josephus, Romano-Jewish historian born in Jerusalem, at the time part of Roman Judea. Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, better known as Pliny the Younger, Roman magistrate, lawyer and author. Emperor Trajanus, Emperor Hadrianus. For non-Roman authors we're going to read from Lucian of Samosata, a Syrian satirist and rhetorician, and Mara bar Serapion, Stoic philosopher from the Roman province of Syria. Now we're going to jump right into the historical mentions, and at the end of each mention I will give you a sort of validation, so I'll tell you how much validity that mention has. But in order to fully understand and appreciate these mentions, there are two things that I need to talk about, and I'll do that in the second part of the video, so make sure to watch until the end because they're very important. First, the actual historically most plausible date of birth of Jesus of Nazareth, which is now most historians agree that it's not going to be 1 AD, it's a different date, and I'll tell you about it, I'll justify it historically, and secondly, the most probable date of his actual crucifixion. And these are important for the following reason. Usually people who try to disprove the existence of historical Jesus use these 2 points of argument. The source materials that we are going to examine are not contemporary to his life. If such an important man was to be around, Roman authorities would have definitely said much more about him. Both statements are actually very interesting, but ultimately hold no water, and I'll justify this because of 2 reasons. First is the actual contextualization of when Jesus existed, which is very important, but secondly, it's also the real historically accurate perspective of Roman central power. So again, make sure to watch until the end. First we're going to use the surviving portions of Tacitus' 2 major works, the Annales and the Historiae, where he speaks about the reigns of several emperors, such as Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, basically after the death of the first emperor Augustus in 14 AD, all the way up to 70 AD, which is roughly speaking the date of the first Jewish-Roman war, which dates from 66 to 73. It's in his final work, Annals of Imperial Rome, Book 15, Chapter 44, that Tacitus talks about Christ. He talks about his execution by Pontius Pilatus, who was the 5th governor of Judea under Emperor Tiberius, and the presence and existence of early Christians in Rome. In this book specifically, he is chronicling the burning of Rome, which happened in 64 AD. Sed non ope humana, non largitionibus principis, aut deum placamentis, decedebat infamia, quin iussum incendium crederetur. But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiation of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Ergo, abolendo rumori, Nero subdibit reos et quaesitissimis poenis adfecit, quos per flagitia in visos vulgus Christianos appellabat. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Auctor nominis eius Christus Tibero imperiante per procuratorem Pontium Pilatum supplicio ad fectus erat, repressaque in praesens, exitiabilis, superstitio rursum erumpebat, non modo per Iudaem, originem eius mali, sed per urben etiam, quo cuncta undique atrocia aut pudenta confluunt. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. As a Roman historian, Tacitus had no Christian bias. In fact, he had no sympathy for the Christians. He speaks about their abominations, and he speaks of Christianity as the origin of evil. And when he uses the expression abomination, he's actually referring specifically to the early Christians believing that they were partaking, or at least some early Christians believing that they were partaking of the literal body and blood of Christ every time they were taking the sacrament, which sounded as an abomination to Roman ears. So what Tacitus is telling us here is that Jesus was executed by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, for crimes against the state, and a religious movement of his followers sprang up in his wake. Remember, this is not seen by Roman authorities as a positive thing, it's seen as a negative thing. We could in fact refer to this as the first documented confrontation between early Christians and Roman authorities. Also, please notice that Tacitus never accused Nero of being the one who burnt Rome. Such accusation will come from Cassius Dio in the 3rd century, but what Tacitus is saying is that Nero, in his opinion, was using Christians as scapegoats. From this statement we learn that there were a sizable number of Christians in Rome at the time, that it was possible to distinguish between Christians and Jews in Rome, and that at the time pagans made a connection between Christianity in Rome and its origins in Roman Judea. Okay, so let's discuss the validity. Most scholars consider Tacitus' explanation and mentions of Jesus and his execution to be of high historical value, and it is generally considered to be an authentic, independent Roman source. To add to that, you have to remember that when Tacitus wrote history, if he considered the information that he was presented to be not entirely reliable, such as hearsay or something that he hadn't witnessed himself, he would normally add indications for the readers. No such indication has been added to this specific mention. As a negative point, however, I do need to mention the fact that no original manuscript from Tacitus is preserved to this day, and the majority of what we have are copies, or we should say later copies, some of which were made by Christian monks. Now, were the contents of this message changed or altered in any way by the medieval monks that were copying this manuscript into their own abbey? Well, of course, we can't know for sure. Most historians agree that the message is authentic. However, I do need to point out that a spelling correction did happen. Some sort of alteration did occur. In fact, at the time, two kinds of spellings and two kinds of words to speak about Christians were used. Christianos with an I and Christianos with an E. The medieval version instead will always be Christianos with an I, and we notice that there is a space in one of the two manuscripts between the I used for Cri and the Stianos, and that is because originally probably was written with an E, which would have filled the gap, but that was removed as a form of correction by monks. So yes, some alteration happened, but most scholars believe that the message is authentic. Now let's talk about the very famous Testimonium Flavium written by Josephus, a very famous Romano-Jewish historian. But what do we mean by Romano-Jewish? You see, Josephus was born in Jerusalem, and he was the leader of the forces in Galilee that fought against the Romans. So initially, he was an enemy to Rome. The thing is that when he faced the legions of Vespasianus in 67, he was defeated and captured. Now, the only reason why Vespasianus, or Vespasian, didn't kill him is because supposedly Josephus had prophesied that Vespasianus would become emperor. And in fact, 2 years later, in AD 69, Vespasianus does become the emperor of Rome, and he likes Josephus because of this. So he keeps him first as a slave, then as a translator, and eventually, when Josephus fully defected to the Roman side, he is granted Roman citizenship, which is what we mean by saying that he was Romano-Jewish. He even served as the translator when Titus, Vespasianus' son, led the siege of Jerusalem. in AD 70. He wrote The Antiquities of the Jews, in which he mentions several biblical figures, including Jesus Christ, John the Baptist, James, the brother of Jesus, Pontius Pilate, the Sadducees, the high priests, and the Pharisees. So all of this can be cross-referenced with the Gospel. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was so good and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Now, of course, this is a very powerful testimony, but we are not 100% sure if we can fully trust it. Most of the testimony has very strong historical validity, but a Jewish man who had defected into Rome, calling Jesus the Messiah, and specifically speaking about the resurrection after 3 days, are thought to be maybe Christian alterations. It is, however, widely accepted that this testimony originally consisted of an authentic nucleus with a reference to the execution of Jesus by Pilate, which was then the subject to interpolation. Now, this is a very big discussion and I can't really jump into it in details because just from 1937 to the 1980s, 87 articles have been written about the validity of this, and there are people taking their stance in all sorts of positions. People that say it's completely useless, people that say it's 100% correct, and people that take a sort of middle ground. I take the middle ground. I believe that the nucleus, the core, speaking about Jesus and his execution, are correct, but it is possible that both the resurrection and the mention of the word Messiah were added. It is also interesting to see that there is another writer, a Christian writer, the very first one to speak about this testimony specifically, and it's Origen. And hear what he says. Origen said of Josephus, although not far from the truth, he did not believe in Jesus as the Christ, an affirmation that was repeated in his Contra Celsum. Because of this, I believe that it's highly likely that he did actually mention Jesus Christ and the crucifixion, but he didn't mention the other two things. Otherwise, this Christian author wouldn't have even have any reason to complain. Let's now read the words of Magistrate Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor. The Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust, when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate, and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Later, Pliny writes a letter to Emperor Trajanus, and he specifically says that the teachings of the Christians were, open quotes, excessive and contagious superstition, close quotes. He also says that Christians attracted people of all social classes, of all genders, and of all ages. Now let's read the reply from Emperor Trajanus. The method you have pursued, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those denounced to you as Christians is extremely proper. It is not possible to lay down any general rule which can be applied as the fixed standard in all cases of this nature. No search should be made for these people. When they are denounced and found guilty, they must be punished, with the restriction, however, that when the party denies himself to be a Christian and shall give proof that he is not, that is, by adoring our gods, he shall be pardoned on the ground of repentance, even though he may have formerly incurred suspicion. Informations without the accuser's name subscribed must not be admitted in evidence against anyone, as it is introducing a very dangerous precedent and by no means agreeable to the spirit of the age. Now, this is extremely significant. First and foremost, what does the emperor mean when he says, the method you have pursued, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those denounced to you as Christians is extremely proper? Well, you have to understand one thing about both Pliny the Younger and Tacitus. Both of them had the duty of supervising trials of Christians, which is precisely why they documented it. So in this letter, Emperor Trajanus is saying, yes, very good, you're doing well. They need to be stopped. But even more interesting is what he says about his gods, and this really gives us the first perspective as the first part of those two introductory lines that I mentioned at the beginning, the perspective of the Romans. Now this is the religious perspective of the Romans. When people tell you, why didn't the Romans do something if there was a man preaching in Judea such as Jesus? Why don't we have much more information about it? Well, the answer is, as you can read from the letter, the words of the emperor himself, from the point of view of the Romans, religious freedom was something that it was always granted. In other words, the Romans didn't care what god you were worshipping in your lands. Once it became a Roman province, all they wanted to make sure is that it remained under Roman control. But a certain degree of religious freedom was always given, so we shouldn't imagine that to the Romans it really meant much that a preacher was going around preaching some doctrine that they thought was strange. To the point of view of the Romans, you can worship whatever god you want. We beat you in battles, our gods are more powerful than yours, and that's all that matters. So why does the situation change now? Well, the reason why the situation changes now is because we're talking about Christians in Rome. So it is only when these followers of Christ enter Rome and Greece, so very, very close provinces to Rome, that the Roman authorities, the central power of Rome, starts to be actually interested in Christians. As far as Jesus was ministering in Judea, they did not care. Even the miracles, if you think about it, even if miracles were reported to Roman emperors or Roman authorities, they would have been shrugged off either as superstition, as we can see in fact the word is used, but even if they were to believe it, this is how it would go. Our Kaiser, there is a man who is performing miracles in Judea. A magician in Judea? What sort of miracles? He can raise people from the dead. What people? Who did he raise? Oh, a friend of his by the name of Lazarus. Is that it? He raised a man? Okay, good for him. The point I'm trying to draw here is the only miracle that could have really interested Roman authorities could have been, sir, this man made an entire legion disappear. Or, sir, this man can multiply swords and armor. In other words, from the perspective of the ancient Roman, if it doesn't directly threaten Roman military control, it does not matter. From a Roman point of view, Jesus' birth means absolutely nothing, because Judea was considered to be a backwater province in the fringes of the empire. And even his ministry, which, if we are to believe the Christian reports, was only 3 years, wouldn't have mattered much to the Romans. Which explains why, if they heard of him, they would have called him either a magician, a superstitious wise man, which is exactly what we are finding in the letters. It only starts mattering for the Romans once the followers grow in numbers and enter Rome. As far as the validity of Pliny the Younger's testimony, it's complete general consensus that it's authentic. Also because we have the letter of response of Emperor Trajan, which again speaks about the same thing, so the two things can be double-checked and cross-referenced. It's authentic. Now let's talk about the words of Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, who was the chief secretary of Emperor Hadrianus. He says, because the Jews of Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled them from the city. After the Great Fire of Rome during Nero's reign, punishments were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. Again, notice both the negative approach and negative point of view of these mentions towards the Christians, but most importantly, of historical significance, the mention of the instigator, meaning Chrestus, which is again a different spelling of Christus, both being a period for the time. Now, the validity of these testimonies at the moment is not questioned in the academia, and that is because you have to remember that the Romans were particularly meticulous when it came to both records, and these are all period. Now let's talk about non-Roman mentionings, and one of the most interesting ones is a letter written by Mara Bar Serapion of Syria. To give you a little bit of context, at this time the writer was in prison and he was writing this letter to his son. He says, "What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death, Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burying Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. Now, even though on this letter there is no mention of the word Christos or the name Christos, or should we say title, Messiah, it is still interesting because he does call him the King of the Jews, which we know was not only an expression that was not used by the Christians, but it was an expression that is linked to what was written on top of the cross of Jesus with the letters in Ri, which translate Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judae. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. But again, beyond Rome, we have got the satirist Lucian of Samosata. In his writing, he's actually mocking the Christians. And here is what he says. The Christians, worship a man to this day. The distinguished personage who introduced the novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers, from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. Now again, this is one of those non-Roman mentions that do not use the term Christ specifically, but they do mention the crucifixion. They call him a sage and a lawgiver. And also further on in his writing, Lucian mentions that the Christians were using sacred writings. But we still have more. In the Jewish Talmud, we have a mention of the crucifixion of Christ, which is again a non-Christian mention. It reads, "On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, 'He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf.' But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover." This was written between 70 and 200 AD. We already know that the majority of historians, scholars and Biblists all understand and agree that 1 AD, the traditionally accepted date of birth of Jesus, is incorrect, and it's because of a calculation error made during the creation of the Gregorian calendar. That is also strengthened by the testimonies that we have on the Gospels themselves. Both Luke and Matthew associate Jesus' birth with the time of Herod the Great. Now notice, the time of Herod the Great, not his son Herod the Great, who was the king of the Jews. Now Herod the Great historically, and that's a historically proven date, dies in 4 BC. So already we can see that the date of birth of Christ cannot be AD 1, but it has to be sometime before 4 BC. I know it sounds strange to say that Christ's birth was sometime before Christ, but now another important event that can help us understand when exactly that happened is a Roman census, because it is mentioned again in the Gospels and in other accounts. But what is a Roman census? In ancient Rome, a census was the act of counting the people and evaluating their property for taxation in a given province. Now, Roman census happened all the time. So a number of censuses were most likely performed throughout the Roman world under Sentius Saturninus. We know that an important census happened in AD 6, but then again that one is no use for us. But we also know that another very important census happened exactly in that area in 8 BC. Now this helps us because then we understand that Jesus' birth most likely occurred between 8 BC and 4 BC. Given the information of the murder of the innocents that again we have at the hand of King Herod, so obviously before he's dead, when he wanted every child born between age 0 and age 2 to be killed, and that does happen around that time, I believe that the most historically probable date would be 6 BC. Now that's significant because if Jesus was born in 6 BC, then at what age was he actually crucified? Another event in Jesus' life that can help us pinpoint the date of the crucifixion is something that happened before, and it's very, very important. That is the baptism of Jesus, and at the same time of the baptism, something else happens. That is the famous event, gospel event, whereby Jesus literally rebukes the merchants at the temple because they were selling animals and he didn't like that. It's a very famous gospel event. That event happened very closely to his baptism. The accounts tell us that that incident at the temple happened after 46 years from the building of said temple. Let's now cross this gospel reference and Jewish reference with, again, Josephus Flavius, the Roman historian. He tells us that, again, this specific temple was built in 20 BC, which means 20 BC plus 46 years, we are in 26 AD, which would be the year of the actual baptism of Christ. Now, connecting this with the previously explained information of Christ's actual date of birth being 6 BC, that would mean that his baptism occurred at age 32. This already creates a completely different story, because it also tells us that most likely he didn't actually die at age 33, but he died older than that, and it is very possible that his death or crucifixion, even though I can't really give you a specific date, would have happened sometime before 37 AD, which is the death of Emperor Tiberius. This is interesting because it pushes everything a bit forward. It tells us that he was alive longer than we thought. It tells us that he was born before that we thought. And it also means that if you look at these two dates now, the historian Josephus Flavius that we are reading today was born specifically in AD 37, which means he would have been born sort of immediately after Jesus' crucifixion. So he would have been basically contemporary. And Publius Cornelius Tacitus himself, who was born in 55, it would have been very close to the very end of Jesus' life and then the beginning of the ministry of his followers. All of this is interesting because it means that the majority, not all of them, but the majority of the accounts that we have read today would have happened within approximately 40-50 years from Jesus' death, which is extremely close, and we could say basically contemporary from a historical standpoint. I mean, when we talk about a lot of the information that we say about Alexander the Great, well, some of the things are actually 400 years after. Not everything, but some of the things are 400 years after, and they are still considered valid. So I would say that these events and the testimonials that we have read, the majority are relatively contemporary. So, with all being said, in conclusion, what is my conclusion about the historical figure of Jesus or Yeshua? We have enough historical information to state confidently that Jesus of Nazareth existed and was a historically proven figure. His appeal extended beyond the Jews and included Greeks. Jewish leaders of the day had an unfavorable opinion of him. He was mostly ignored by Roman authorities until his followers started preaching, which justifies the reason why we don't have more information about him while he was still alive. He was then crucified when Pontius Pilate was prefect of Judea. And that concludes our journey, historical journey, into the life of Jesus as far as his historical figure is concerned. If you liked this video, please thumbs up, and if you want me to continue this and make it into a series, we could discuss, for example, what he would have probably looked like and sort of examine early art and modern art and see what gets closer to a more historically probable appearance and look, and many other interesting topics. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much for all of you who have watched up to this point, because I mean this is a very long video. Thank you so much, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.